So I'm really excited to be able to present this report here in Yellowknife. I had an opportunity to give a similar talk last year in Whitehorse, which was useful, I think, for the community there. But since it was all about Yellowknife, it was unfortunate that there wasn't more representation there from the sector to hear the talk. So I'd like to thank Cernoka for making this possible. I'd also like to thank Dr. Francis Abel back for having encouraged me to undertake this project. The genesis of this project actually happened at this same workshop 4 years ago in a conversation between Francis and Aggie Brockman about the potential to write a report on the voluntary and nonprofit sector and what it looked like, what its challenges are and its needs, and what its potential future is here in Yellowknife. So my talk today will be divided into two parts. This afternoon I'll be outlining some of the findings from my report, which is, I have a slide about it, but it's this right here, Yellowknife's Voluntary and Nonprofit Sector, A Portrait of a Northern Social Economy. And it's available on the Cernoka website as well as the Carleton Center for Community Innovation website. And this evening at the Social Economy Cafe, I'll talk more informally about Yellowknife's social economy over the years and provide some highlights, including the building of public toilets in 1938 and how that occurred through what we would now call the social economy. So I hope you'll be able to join me then we can let down our hair and talk about other things.
You call them outhouses.
Yeah, our outhouses, there you go. Public latrines.
Social.
Oh yeah. Okay, so that's just the information about the research report, and it was issued in February 2011. So the report makes three overlapping arguments. And the first is that Yellowknife's voluntary and nonprofit sector is part of a larger social economy, and it contributes to the NWT's social and economic health and promotes robust democracy and civil society. I think something that's been absent from some government approaches to the voluntary and nonprofit sector is their seemingly inability to think about it as a sector, to understand the sports teams at one end straight through to the Center for Northern Families at the other as all part of one body of organizations which require support and nurturing. The second argument is that Yellowknife's voluntary and nonprofit sector must have a coordinated and cohesive voice to promote and secure good public policy to overcome current challenges that they're facing. I'm going to outline in this presentation some of those challenges and how they might be addressed. And then finally, the federal, territorial, and municipal governments need to renew their commitment to the voluntary and nonprofit sector. I think it's important to commend the City of Yellowknife in particular for always having been a champion of the sector. But there's certainly more that the federal government can do, although that's probably an ideological impasse at this point. But there is a lot that the territorial government can also do to invest in the sector. So I've included in this presentation the 17th Assembly's priorities. Aggie mentioned them already today. They were announced last Thursday. This is a list that I pulled off the CBC. And what you'll notice is that the voluntary nonprofit sector is not mentioned, nor is there an anti-poverty component to this that's expressly mentioned. So even after all of the work that's been completed to raise awareness about the voluntary and nonprofit sector, about its ability to alleviate poverty, to encourage economic growth in Yellowknife and across the territory, it still hasn't been able to jump that gap and make its way into the main priorities of the government. So from a historical perspective, there was a period when things were looking up for the social economy in the north. The federal government from about 2000 to 2006 was investing heavily in the voluntary and nonprofit sector through three large programs. And probably the most obvious benefit to the Yellowknife community was the creation of Volunteer NWT. Now this was an organization that had a few purposes. One was a capacity building function where it would provide training to voluntary nonprofit organizations, tell them how to fill out their tax returns and provide board training. There was a communications function, so there was a newsletter that actually Aggie, I've mentioned it 8 times in this presentation, but anyway, put together and sent out to the whole community in order to educate them about what was going on, so that you could really start to create that sense of community amongst voluntary and nonprofit organizations. But unfortunately, Volunteer NWT was, well, it was canceled. The program was canceled, the funding ran out at the federal level, and then the territorial government provided 1 year of sort of emergency funding, and then after that it closed. So the sector's really lost in Yellowknife a cohesive voice, a place to go, a meeting place, where they're able to exchange ideas, resources, and information to make Yellowknife a better place. So while all of these programs are going on at the federal level, the GNWT was not replicating them at the territorial level. And one of the aspects of this research was to ask why that was. Why wasn't the GNWT capitalizing on the resources that were available with the federal government to provide programming supports to the voluntary and nonprofit sector? And I think there's 2 reasons. One, the voluntary nonprofit sector for a long time was maligned to line departments of the GNWT, so they weren't in the central core agencies. I see a table of the executive sitting right over there, so they weren't part of the executive. There was a move after the last election to bring them into the executive, although that didn't seem to have the positive outcomes that many in the sector were hoping. The second reason why substantive policy measures were not introduced by the territorial government was dynamics within the legislature, or the legislative assembly. It's very difficult under the consensus government for things to happen in Yellowknife. There's a tension between Yellowknife MLAs and MLAs from the communities over providing more funding or more programs or more supports to the large city. And in part this is very understandable. There's a lot of social issues and other infrastructure issues which are occurring in communities across the NWT, and so the priorities lie elsewhere. But because of the sort of brokerage politics which exists between MLAs who are not part of political parties and therefore don't necessarily come to Yellowknife with a common platform, it's very difficult for them to come together and provide programming where it's needed if it goes against some of the other priorities of individual members. So the second half of the report, and I'd encourage you to take a look at this part of the report if you have a chance, because there's a lot of wonderful commentary from leaders in the voluntary and nonprofit sector here in Yellowknife about the challenges which they're facing. And I'd just like to go over a few of them. The first and probably most important is an uncertain operating environment which we've now entered. Following the 2008 economic crisis and then subsequent global recession, we've seen a lot of pressure being placed on the voluntary and nonprofit sector here in Yellowknife as across the country. Decreased funding, so there's been funding cuts from governments as they deal with their own deficits, decreased public donations, and then increased public demand for those services. So while all the funding is being pulled out of the voluntary and nonprofit sector, people are coming to the voluntary and nonprofit sector for help as they lose their jobs and go through this economic storm. A second significant challenge facing Yellowknife's voluntary and nonprofit sector is the labor market here, the unique labor market in Yellowknife, and the cost of living. The voluntary nonprofit sector organizations, those that have staff, operate on very small budgets. And so they often, whereas in the South, in Toronto or Ottawa or Vancouver, you may be able to find students or other persons willing to work part-time. It's very difficult to find part-time employment or part-time employees for an organization here in Yellowknife. And that may be all the resources they have in terms of being able to hire someone. Second labor market issue is the instability in 1- and 2-year or 3-year contracts from the GNWT. If you don't know that you're going to be able to fund your organization at the end of the next fiscal year, there's going to be a lot of people who will say, I can't take that risk. I have a mortgage, I have a family, I can't go and work in the voluntary nonprofit sector if I don't know if there will be a job for me. And then the final sort of labor market issue is that because voluntary nonprofit sector organizations can't pay as much as government and private industry, employees are often poached and taken on by the government or by the private sector because they can pay benefits and they can provide permanent employment. The third challenge that I outline is the funding model challenge, and this comes back to the sort of the agreements which are made between the GNWT, its various departments, and nonprofit organizations. There was a directive at one point within the GNWT to increase the length of contracts from 1 year to 3 years in order to do two things, really. One, to provide greater stability to organizations, but two, to alleviate the pressures of constantly applying for funding. It was mentioned during the breakout session that for some organizations $20,000 isn't worth it because it might take $15,000 worth of time and energy to apply for that money and then to report back to either the federal or territorial government once that money's spent. Another funding issue, of course, is core funding. So there's very little funding available to anyone to run those core services within an organization. It might amount to 5 to 10% of an individual programming contract. And so you have to gather together a whole bunch of contracts in order to be able to run your office. Then the final set of challenges are recognition, well, they're listed there, but the first one is recognition. There's a lack of recognition about the work that the voluntary nonprofit sector does in Yellowknife and across the NWT. In many instances, they're gap-filling organizations. Because they have the flexibility of working outside government, they're able to identify issues and address them quickly, and address them in a way that responds to community needs. And I think that sometimes there's not the recognition on the part of the government that they're providing services which are necessary and core to the survival of many communities. And that's unfortunate because they're picking up the slack where the government isn't offering services. There are small recognition programs on the part of the GNWT, volunteer awards, and appearing at conferences and whatnot. But they're more tokenisms as opposed to actual substantive supports that really recognize the value that the voluntary nonprofit sector is bringing to the community. There's also training and organizational support issues. There isn't often, when you have to fill out ever-increasing amounts of paperwork and ever more difficult funding applications, there often isn't the money to send people down south to Edmonton or to Ottawa to do the 3 days training to learn how to fill out the forms to apply for that $20,000 to run X program. So those types of supports, things that the government can do and provide resources for to help organizations undertake this work, I think is really important. And then finally is volunteer and WT, and I just use it as the example of what's so important is that, and many of you work in the voluntary nonprofit sector. I spoke to many of you for this report, and you're so busy undertaking your own work and making sure that your programs run and that you have funding for the next year and that you're meeting all your clients' needs, that you don't have time to get together or to discuss common issues, and then to move to the action stage to go forward to government and to lobby them for help and to identify issues within the sector that can be addressed by state action. And so the absence and loss of an organization like Volunteer and WT means that there isn't that voice for these important organizations. And to be asking you to do more, is perhaps asking too much. So the report has a few policy recommendations, things that can be done quickly, and then also, so the idea of developing a policy and advocacy network in some way. When I was puzzling through this, I was thinking about Alternatives North as a model, a coalition, but then again that takes lunch times and evenings, and other volunteer work on the side of the work, the core work that's being done by these organizations. In your package, I noticed that there is the Yukon Social Economy newsletter where they talk about the Yukon Volunteer Bureau, and I encourage you to take a look at that because that's another model which has been successful in the North. It's similar to Volunteer NWT in many of its functions, but the way it came about is quite different. It was funded in part by one of the Aboriginal self-governments, and as well as I think the United Way. I have to check that, but its core funding started there, and then it took on activities for the government of the Yukon in order to continue operating. And then in terms of sector priority issues, there was a few things that came out that I didn't get a chance to discuss throughout, but there's a cap on municipal funding for the voluntary and nonprofit sector. I think it's capped at 2% of the operating budget of the city of Yellowknife. They can't give any more, and they've actually maxed that out. And it's a bit of economic paternalism on the part of the GNWT trying to curtail the way in which the city of Yellowknife uses its funds. So one of the sort of easy fixes would be to lift that, and that's important because the city of Yellowknife does provide core funding to organizations. It's not a lot of money, but it's more than any other level of government is currently offering. The second is to fully implement multi-year funding contracts across the GNWT, and then the third is to secure funding for one of the policy and advocacy network that I just spoke about. So this is all contained in the report that was issued in February, so I hope that some of you will have the opportunity to take a look at that. There were some good ideas in there. Hopefully you'll be able to use them in your own organizations to move forward on these issues and to support, to a greater extent, the great work that's being done by the voluntary nonprofit sector in Yellowknife. So, thank you.